Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 1, Crusades prior to the rise of the Ayyubid state. Start of Part 7 of Chapter 3. The conquest of Edessa, the most important deed of Imad ad-Deen Zangi. Imad ad-Deen was able to achieve a great deal of what he had planned and to acquire for himself a special position in Islamic history as a brilliant politician, a capable military man, and an aware Muslim who understood the danger that surrounded the Muslim world due to the Crusaders. Thus he was able to make the best use of the historical circumstances in the Muslims' favor by bringing together the Muslim forces after dealing with the factors that caused division and uniting the various cities and emirates within the framework of a single state. He made brilliant use of all his abilities and the resources he had to offer in order to achieve his twin aims of forming an Islamic front and striking the Crusaders. The conquest of Edessa is regarded as one of the most important achievements of Imad ad-Deen Zangi, because the county of Edessa was the first Crusader principality to be established in the east. It was founded in 491 Hijri, that is 1097 Common Era, under the leadership of Baldwin I, who continued to rule this principality until 494 Hijri, that is 1100 Common Era, when he left to rule Jerusalem following the death of Geoffrey, king of Jerusalem. Edessa differed from the other Crusader principalities in that it was located in the Euphrates basin, where it carried the burden of defending all the other Crusader principalities in Syria, because it was situated close to the Abbasid Caliphate, and thus stood in the face of the Turkmens, who had crowded into Mesopotamia following the disintegration of the Seljuk state in Syria and Iraq after the death of the Sultan Malik Shah in 485 Hijri, that is 1092 Common Era. The importance of Edessa was not limited to its strategic location, and its being the first line of defense for the other Crusader principalities in Syria. It posed a fundamental danger to the Muslim transportation routes between Syria, Asia Minor, Iraq, and Mesopotamia. Despite the fact that Edessa did not fall within the limits of the Holy Lands in Palestine, the Crusaders regarded it as one of the noblest of cities after Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople. It had abundant wealth which helped the rulers of Edessa to expand their territory. So the Principality of Edessa, located on the two banks of the Euphrates, expanded from Ravendan and Antonia in the west to Mashriq in the east, and from Behesni and Kassoun in the north to Manbij in the south. Edessa attained special importance because of the strength and courage of its rulers, who managed to withstand the Islamic resistance despite the fact that it suffered two clear weak points. 1. Its lack of natural borders to offer it protection or fortification. 2. The lack of harmony among its inhabitants, who were a mixture of Eastern Christians, Syriacs and Jacobite Armenians, and Western Crusaders, in addition to the Muslims who were concentrated in entire cities such as Suruj and Bira, which were under Crusader control. Edessa was not important only to the Crusaders. However, as in the view of the Muslims, it was one of the most vital positions where they needed to gain control. Ibn al-Athir mentioned its importance to Mesopotamia because of its location between Mosul and Aleppo, and he described it as being of the utmost importance to Mesopotamia itself and to the Muslim lands because of its fortifications, which made the Islamic forces in both Iraq and Syria eager to gain control of it. The internal situation in Edessa. The internal situation in Edessa was very favorable to Imad ad-Din Zangi, as its ruler Jocelyn II was a weak character who was swayed by emotions, whims and desires, and lacking in political ability and farsightedness. In fact, Jocelyn II's inclination towards the Armenians was influenced by his upbringing, because his mother was Armenian, so he grew up with a fondness for the Armenians and other original inhabitants who were Eastern Christians, and he preferred them to the Western Christians, a fact which annoyed the Crusader knights and created a kind of instability in the principality. It was known that the ruler of Edessa was a person who preferred ease and comfort, to such an extent that when Imad ad-Din Zangi attacked his kingdom, he chose to leave his city and stay in Turbessel on the west bank of the Euphrates. If we add to that the fact that the Muslims surrounded this principality on all sides, and that it was separated by the Euphrates from all the other Crusader principalities in Syria, we will be able to form a general idea of the factors which contributed to its downfall. It is worth mentioning that this principality posed a great danger to Muslim transportation routes between Aleppo, Mosul, Baghdad, and the Seljuks of Rome in Asia Minor. It also formed an obstacle that prevented the establishment of Muslim unity in Syria and Mesopotamia because of its continual interference in favor of Imad ad-Din Zangi's opponents among the Muslim emirs in the region. Thus, conquering it became necessary in political, military, economic, and religious terms. Operations that led to conquest. Imad ad-Din Zangi took advantage of the circumstances mentioned above and devised a trick that would allow him to reach his goal in the shortest way. He knew that he would never be able to achieve his aim in Edessa so long as Jocelyn and his forces remained there. Hence, he focused on finding a way to make his opponent leave that capital. He headed towards Amid, making a show of intending to besiege it, as if that was his only goal. At the same time, he sent his spies to the Edessa region so that they could send him immediate information on the movements of its ruler. As soon as Jocelyn realized that Zangi and his army were busy in Diyarbakir and did not have time to attack the Crusader positions, he left his capital at the head of his troops, after taking precautions by making a truce with Kara Arsalan, the ruler of Hassan Kaf, who had sought refuge with him after Zangi threatened his emirate. Then he headed to Turbessel, on the west bank of the Euphrates, where he set aside any sense of responsibilities and focused on his physical pleasures, leaving the defense of Edessa to its people, the Armenians, Syriacs, Nestorians, and Jacobites, most of whom were merchants who had no experience of war and fighting, whilst mercenaries took on the task of defending the citadel. Imad ad-Din Zangi's informants came and told him the news that he had been longing to hear, so he immediately headed towards Edessa, moving fast by riding camels, and mobilizing every Muslim in the region who could carry a weapon to join the jihad to make the word of Allah supreme. He was soon joined by hordes of volunteers, with whom he surrounded Edessa from all four directions. In the beginning, he tried to pursue all peaceful means, hoping to achieve his aim without being forced to brandish the sword. He made contact with the people of Edessa, offering them security and asking them to open the gates before he found himself forced to destroy the walls of their city and evict its people. But they refused to accept this offer of security. At that point, Zangi intensified the siege, using huge siege engines which he had brought with him to destroy the walls in order to deny the Crusaders the opportunity to join forces to save this important position. When Jocelyn heard the news, he sent word asking for help from all the Crusader principalities in Syria. But no one responded except Melisende, the heiress of Jerusalem, whose help came too late. He also tried to enter the city, or send help to support its defenders, but he was prevented from doing so. On 26th Jamadi-ul-Sani, 539 Hijri, 28 days after the siege began, part of the fortress collapsed as the result of the concentrated strikes to which it had been subjected, and the Muslim forces entered the city. The citadel surrendered 2 days later, and the Jacobite bishop Basil handed Edessa over to Zangi. Imad ad-Deen Zangi's policies in Edessa. After conquering Edessa, Imad ad-Deen Zangi did not think that it made political sense to destroy such a city. He issued orders to his troops, telling them to stop killing, capturing, and plundering, and to return whatever prisoner and booty they had seized. They returned everything, and nothing worth mentioning was missing. After that, he issued further instructions to restore order quickly to the city and to rebuild whatever had been destroyed during the long weeks of fighting. He appointed those whom he thought most qualified to organize the city's affairs, take care of it, and strive hard to serve it, and he promised its people that they would be treated well and with justice, aiming to win over its original inhabitants, the Eastern Christians, against the Catholic Crusaders, which is confirmed by the fact that he ordered that a number of Catholic churches be destroyed, but he left the Eastern churches alone. Factors which helped Imad ad-Deen Zangi. There are a number of factors which helped Imad ad-Deen to liberate Edessa, among which were the following. A. The growth of the Islamic Jihad movement prior to his rule, which enabled him to learn from the experience of Muslims in this field. Undoubtedly, previous experience had shown that the Principality of Edessa was vulnerable enough to be the first Crusader principality to fall into the hands of the leaders of the Islamic Jihad at that time. It had become severely weakened due to the ongoing raids by the Atabegs of Mosul, in particular for more than 40 years, which was like a slow death until it was dealt the final blow in 539 Hijri. B. In addition to that, the military genius of Zangi took that Crusader state by surprise, after the Crusaders had felt secure and thought that he would never attack them. He took advantage of the absence of its ruler Jocelyn II and aimed the final blow at it, which resulted in its fall. This proves that this great Muslim leader chose the right time for that important military action. C. Furthermore, the dispute between the principalities of Edessa and Antioch in turn affected Edessa, and exhausted it both politically and militarily in a manner which proves that the differences that arose between the Crusader leaders had an impact on their political entities. Here we see the Principality of Edessa, fortunately, paying the price by falling into the hands of the leaders of the Islamic Jihad, who deserved it at that time. D. On the other hand, we should not ignore the character of Edessa's ruler, Jocelyn II, who was not of the same level of political and military competence as his father Jocelyn I. He was more inclined to a life of promiscuity, immorality, and the pursuit of physical pleasures. He often left Edessa itself and went to Turbessel in search of various licentious activities. The Muslims discovered this weak point in him, and their leader made the most of it by attacking Edessa in the absence of Jocelyn II, thus dealing it a fatal blow. It seems that the second Crusader generation, which succeeded the first generation that had established and protected the Crusader presence, was not able to preserve what their predecessors had built. Indeed, they did not realize the importance of their historical role in that highly sensitive situation, in which they were surrounded by the Muslims of all sides. Hence Jocelyn II, without realizing it, contributed to the success of the Islamic Jihad movement, which at that time was led by Imad ad-Deen Zangi. Whatever the case, it seems that some Western historians tried to highlight the factors of internal weakness in Edessa and regarded these factors alone as what led to its downfall. Their aim in so doing is to undermine the Muslims' political and military actions. But historical logic dictates that we should think of both internal and external factors combined as playing a role in the victory of 539 Hijri, that is 1144 Common Era. Regardless of the internal factors and their outcome in Edessa, the city would not have fallen without the military action of a gifted leader, such as Imad ad-Deen Zangi and his troops. Anecdotes about the conquest of Edessa. The scholar Moosa al-Armani's clever approach. The Muslim scholar and muazzin, Moosa al-Armani, who was a teacher in madrasa in Mosul, adopted a great approach to the conquest of Edessa, using psychological warfare to support the campaign of Imad ad-Deen Zangi against Edessa in 539 Hijri, that is 1145 Common Era. The scholar joined the siege as a fighter, and a smart idea occurred to him during Imad ad-Deen's siege of the city. He went to the marketplace and bought some Armenian-style clothing. Then he entered the city wearing them, and the Crusaders did not recognize him or become suspicious about him. He explains, "I went to the marketplace and bought some Armenian garments, and dressed as one of them. I went to the city to see what I could find out about it. I came to the mosque and went in, and I saw the minaret and said to myself, 'Let me ascend the minaret and give the adhan and see what happens.' So I ascended and gave the call to prayer, 'Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.' I gave the adhan. The infidels were on the walls, and the cry went up in the city that the Muslims had attacked the city from the other direction. So the infidels stopped fighting and came down from the walls, and the Muslims climbed up and attacked the city." In Sicily. At the time of the conquest of Edessa, the king of Sicily was a Frank. In Sicily there was a righteous Muslim man from North Africa, whom the king used to bring to his court to honor him and listen to what he said, and he preferred him to the monks and priests in his court. At the time that Edessa was being conquered, this Frankish king had sent an army by sea to North Africa, where they raided, plundered, and took prisoners. The news came to the king as he was sitting with this Maghribi scholar, who was feeling drowsy and was almost asleep. The king woke him up and said, "O wise, our companions have done such and such to the Muslims. Why didn't Muhammad help them?" He replied, "He was attending the conquest of Edessa," meaning the followers of the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. The Franks who were present laughed, but the king said to them, "Do not laugh, for by God he is not speaking without knowledge." The king felt very distressed, and before long, news reached them that Edessa had fallen to the Muslims, and this bad news made them forget that earlier good news, because of how important Edessa was to the Christians. A martyr seen in a dream. It is narrated that a righteous man said, "I saw a martyr in a dream after he was killed, in the best shape. I asked him, 'What did Allah do to you?' He said, 'He forgave me.' I said, 'In return for what?' He replied, 'In return for the conquest of Edessa.'" Conspiracy by the inhabitants of Edessa. The Armenian inhabitants of Edessa soon, in the following year, planned a conspiracy in which their aim was to attack the Muslims and return the city to Crusader control after summoning Jocelyn, but Zangi quickly uncovered this dangerous plot and managed to capture and execute the plotters. After that, he banished a number of Armenians so that they would not have the opportunity to try again to stab the Muslims in the back and hand over their most important position to the Crusaders for an easy gain. Consequences of the conquest of Edessa. In conquering Edessa, Imad ad-Din Zangi achieved his most important achievement against the Crusaders during his rule. This victory had important consequences for the Muslim and Christian worlds, among the most important of which were: A. The Muslims became certain that the jihad movement had reached the stage of maturity in political and military terms, and this is not to downplay the achievements made by leaders before Zangi, especially Maudud. It was the first Crusader state that fell into their hands, so it was a beginning. Today Edessa, tomorrow the fall of the other alien Crusader states. This is indeed what came to pass. From this point onwards, there was no turning back. Rather, they could move on with confidence and pride in their achievements. B. History confirms that entities such as this illegitimate Crusader presence could not last on Muslim soil, because the inhabitants of the region who had one religious identity would not accept this alien military and political situation. Thus harmony returned to northern Iraq, and Edessa no longer played the role of division or of a Crusader presence that acted as a buffer zone in preventing contact between the Seljuks of Asia Minor, also known as the Seljuks of Rome, the Seljuks of Iraq, and those in Persia. C. Pressure was put on the Crusader region, which stretched in a long line from Antioch in the north to Eilat, that is Rashrah in the south, and from the Jordan River in the east to the greater Syrian coast, with the exception of Ascalon. Tyre, which included the county of Tripoli and the kingdom of Jerusalem, fell to the Muslims in 1124 Common Era, that is 518 Hijri. Edessa, which was like the tip of the Crusader spear, fell forever, leaving the shaft of the spear, the other Crusader states. Hence the military pressure on them increased, in the form of the Muslim forces who were controlling the Syrian interior parallel to the coastline and coastal plain. In geographical terms, it is as if the battle was now between the coast and the interior, the former now relying basically on exterior European support, whilst the latter relied on plentiful local resources, which became more abundant with the emergence of a Muslim leadership striving for unity among Muslims. D. In this manner, the fall of Edessa led to the revival of a strategic, defensive alliance between the Crusader presence in the east and the motherland in Western Europe. The West could not allow its political and historical ventures in the East to fail one by one. It had to intervene in order to set things straight once more and put an end to the activities of the Emirate of Mosul. Hence it launched another crusade, from 1147 to 1149 Common Era, that is 542 to 544 Common Era, known as the Second Crusade. This was one of the direct consequences of the fall of Edessa, which clearly explains how the leaders of the Islamic Jihad fought off international forces. They were not simply local forces with limited influence and impact. They were part of a continental or global conflict, a fact which gives these leaders a prominent status in the history of the Muslims during the Crusades. E. One of the many consequences of this achievement was the great rise in status of Imad ad-Din Zangi. After being merely a local ruler with limited influence, his name soon started to be mentioned in the annals of the Latin and Syriac peoples, to reflect the fact that he had a major impact on the course of events in the Latin East in an unprecedented manner. With regard to the Muslims, he occupied a prominent position. The conquest of Edessa raised Imad ad-Din in status in the eyes of the Seljuk Sultan Masud and the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtafi li Amrillah. who bestowed on him a number of titles that he had earned, such as Al-Amir al-Muzaffar, that is the victorious leader, Rukn al-Islam, that is the pillar of Islam, Umdad al-Sulatin, that is the foremost among the sultans, Zaim Juyush al-Muslimin, that is the commander of the Muslim armies, Malik al-Umara, that is the king of the amirs, and Amir al-Iraqain wa Sham, that is the Amir of the two Iraqs and Greater Syria. The victory made Imad ad-Din Zangi the foremost defender of the faith and mujahid, who was striving to make the word of Allah supreme. In Muslim gatherings, there was a great deal of talk centered on his character, which shows us the extent of the appreciation and admiration he garnered after achieving this great victory. This victory paved the way for Imad ad-Din Zangi to complete the conquest of neighboring fortresses and impose his authority completely on the possessions of his enemies in the area. The conquest of Edessa played a major role in saving the emirate of Imad ad-Din Zangi from the danger of continual crusader raids, and after living in fear, its inhabitants found security. This, inshallah, was a sign of glad tidings of the reward of paradise for him. End of part 7 of chapter 3.